Amara Obi sat in the shadows of a lavish Lagos ballroom wearing a dark green silk dress, watching her ex-husband kiss her former best friend under a canopy of white orchids. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above them. Guests erupted in applause. Amara's mother-in-law smiled like it was the proudest day of her life. What Amara didn't know was that the most powerful man in the global shipping industry was standing 30 feet away on the VIP balcony, watching her with the kind of focus that rewrites destiny. He wasn't there for the wedding. He was there for her. And before this night ends, Amara is going to discover something every woman needs to know. The difference between a man who treats you like a ladder and a man who treats you like a queen. But to understand why a Korean mafia boss would fly across the world to crash a wedding for a pediatrician he met only once, we need to go back to the moment Amara made a choice that would save his life and unknowingly change hers forever. If you're ready for this story, like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because this story, it's for every woman who has been the anchor while everyone else sailed away on her dime. 7 years ago, Amara thought she had found a partner to build a life with. Instead, she found a man who would take the very empire she funded and hand the keys to her best friend. But we're not starting there. We're starting at the end, or what Amara thought was the end. The ceremony was almost over. Amara forced herself to stand and join the ovation. The sound of her own clapping felt hollow, like her hands belonged to a stranger. A single tear slid down her deep brown cheek, not because she still loved Victor, but because she was watching the public celebration of her own erasure. Every vow he spoke was a promise he had already whispered to her in the middle of the night. Every word about forever was a lie she had spent 7 years and every kobo she owned believing. Amara sat back down and clasped her hands tightly under her chin, just trying to hold herself together while her replacement wore white and her mother-in-law toasted to her downfall. She told herself she just had to survive 2 more hours. 2 hours of pretending, and then she could disappear. What she didn't see was the man in the black suit leaning over the railing, his eyes locked on her emerald pendant, the only thing in this room that mattered to him. He was done watching, and Amara was done being invisible. Amara smoothed the silk of her dark green dress, the fabric cool and unforgiving against her palms. She had chosen this color with a surgical precision, the deep, regal shade of an emerald, a color that signaled life, growth, and the very wealth she had painstakingly built for the man now standing at the altar. It was a silent, dignified scream in a room full of celebratory white and triumphant red. As the priest spoke of sacred bonds, Amara's thumb traced the emerald pendant resting against her collarbone. It was the only thing she had kept from her grandmother, a stone said to protect the wearer from deceit. She felt the bitter irony radiating from the gem like a cold heat. For 7 years, she had been the protector. She had been the one to navigate the treacherous waters of Victor's early failures, using her salary as a pediatrician to keep his dreams afloat, while she subsisted on coffee and hospital cafeteria food. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of Tracy's perfume, a designer blend that Amara had bought for her last Christmas, back when she still believed Tracy was the sister of her soul. Seeing it worn today, as Tracy leaned into Victor's side, felt like a physical violation. Victor's bold red suit jacket was a flare of arrogance in her peripheral vision. He looked like a man who had won a war, never mind that Amara had supplied the armor, the weapons, and the strategy. To have and to hold, Victor's voice rang out, steady and devoid of the tremor it had possessed when he cried on Amara's shoulder 3 years ago, terrified his company would go under. Amara leaned back, her cornrows pulled tight enough to feel like a crown of thorns. Every guest's joyful murmur was a needle prick to her skin. To the elite of Lagos, this was a union of power and beauty. To Amara, it was a heist. She looked down at the gold charger plate in front of her, the surface reflecting her own red-rimmed eyes. She was the one who had taught Victor how to speak to investors. She was the one who had edited his first contracts until her eyes blurred at 3:00 a.m. Now she was sitting at a table near the service entrance, positioned just far enough away to be an afterthought but close enough to be forced to bear witness. She could feel the weight of pity from the aunts and cousins who knew the truth, their glances darting toward her like stinging insects. She stayed perfectly still, her spine a rod of iron. She refused to give them the satisfaction of a collapsed woman. She was Amara Obi, a woman who healed children and survived ghosts. But as the couple turned to face the crowd, their smiles radiant and predatory, she wondered how much longer the emerald could protect her before the darkness of the room finally swallowed her whole. The transition from the ballroom's air-conditioned chill to the memory of the hospital's stifling humidity was almost seamless. 7 years ago, the scent of antiseptic and floor wax had been Amara's second skin. She could still feel the phantom ache in her lower back, the result of standing for 18 hours during back-to-back shifts in the pediatric ward. Every overtime hour, every grueling night spent monitoring a child's fever, had been a deposit into a future she thought was ours. In those early days, the apartment in Aikja was a cramped command center. Victor would sit at the small dining table, surrounded by legal pads and half-eaten cartons of takeout Amara had paid for. He had the vision, he told her, but he lacked the capital. So Amara became the bank. She remembered the scratch of his fountain pen on the first registration papers, the ink bought with her grocery money. She was the one who woke up at 5:00 a.m. to review his business plans before her rounds, catching the logical fallacies he was too tired to see. And then there was Tracy. Tracy had moved into their guest room after a bad breakup, left her destitute, a temporary arrangement that stretched into years. While Amara was at the hospital battling mortality and bureaucracy, Tracy was at home, making Victor the comforting tea that Amara was too busy to brew. Amara recalled coming home at dawn, her scrubs stained with the day's labor, only to find the two of them huddled over a laptop. Tracy would look up with a performative pout, whispering, "Oh, Amara, you look so exhausted. Go sleep, we've got this handled." At the time, Amara felt a surge of gratitude. She thought her best friend was helping her husband build a legacy for their family. She didn't realize Tracy wasn't just helping him with the logistics. She was auditioning for Amara's life. Every time Amara co-signed a loan or used her sterling credit to secure a fleet of delivery trucks, she was unknowingly handing over the keys to her own prison. The first time Victor's company turned a profit, a modest sum that felt like a fortune then, Amara had suggested a small dinner to celebrate. Instead, Victor bought a designer watch for himself and a silk scarf for Tracy, claiming he needed to look the part for clients and thanked Tracy for her unpaid consulting. Amara had smiled, swallowing her disappointment like a bitter pill, telling herself that the strong one didn't need rewards. She believed that as long as she was the foundation, the building would stand. She never imagined that once the roof was finished and the view was perfect, they would simply decide the foundation was no longer necessary to the aesthetic. The memory of the ballroom began to blur, eclipsed by the ghost of a night 2 years ago when the air smelled not of lilies, but of iron and wet pavement. It was a Tuesday, the kind of graveyard shift that bled into a rainy Lagos midnight. Amara was driving home, her mind a dull hum of patient charts, when she saw the black sedan crumpled against a concrete barrier in an alleyway near the docks. Most people would have accelerated, sensing the danger that clung to the shadows of the wharf. But the healer in Amara was louder than her instinct for self-preservation. When she approached the vehicle, she didn't find a common traveler. She found a man slumped against the leather, his light complexion ghostly under the flickering streetlights, his black suit soaked through with a terrifying amount of blood. Kang Tijin hadn't looked like a titan of industry then. He looked like a dying flame. A gunshot wound had torn into his chest, narrowly missing his heart but threatening to drown him from the inside. There was no time for an ambulance, no time for the sterile safety of her hospital. The sound of distant sirens or perhaps the approaching footsteps of his attackers spurred her into a cold, mechanical focus. She had dragged him to the floor of the car, her hands, the same hands that now trembled at a wedding table, becoming steady instruments of survival. With a makeshift kit from her trunk and a flashlight held between her teeth, she performed a frantic back-alley thoracostomy. The rain lashed against the windows, a rhythmic percussion to the wet slide of silk and the frantic beat of her own heart. She remembered the way his eyes had suddenly snapped open, locking onto hers with a lucidity that defied his trauma. He didn't scream. He simply watched her, his gaze an intense, searing weight as she stitched the jagged entry wound by the dim glow of her phone. As the bleeding finally slowed, The sound of black SUVs skidding into the alley signaled that his people had arrived. Amara had stepped back, her dark green scrubs, the ancestors of the dress she wore today, dripping with his life force. A group of men in sharp suits moved with military precision, flanking the car. Before they lifted him away, T-Jin reached out, his fingers brushing the emerald pendant she always wore. He didn't speak, but the silent promise in his eyes was heavier than any spoken vow she had heard today. It was a look of total recognition, an anchoring of souls in the dark. Then, he was gone, leaving only the scent of ozone and the realization that she had just saved the most dangerous man she would ever meet. The heavy silence of Amara's memories was shattered by the sharp clink of a crystal glass. Back in the present, the ballroom was buzzing with a new electric energy that had nothing to do with the newlyweds. Victor, ever the opportunist, had sensed a shift in the room's atmosphere before he even saw the cause. His eyes, usually filled with a practiced, smug warmth, had suddenly sharpened, darting toward the VIP balcony where a figure stood like a silhouette against the gold-leafed ceiling. Victor didn't recognize the man as a ghost from Amara's past. He saw him only as a summit to be climbed. To Victor, the presence of Kang T-Jin was the ultimate validation of his own arrival. He straightened his red suit jacket, his chest swelling with a misplaced pride. He leaned into Tracy's ear, whispering something that made her eyes widen as she looked up. They looked like a pair of social climbers who had just spotted the peak of the mountain. Amara watched, her breath hitching, as Victor excused himself from a group of laughing investors to make his way toward the stairs. He moved with the desperate agility of a man who spent his life chasing shadows of power, oblivious to the fact that the man he was pursuing was currently looking right through him. From her seat at the back, Amara could see the interaction unfold like a silent film. Victor reached the edge of the balcony, his hand extended, his face fixed in a mask of professional sycophancy. He was likely reciting the pitch for his latest logistics expansion, the one Amara had calculated the risk for just 6 months ago. But T-Jin didn't move. He didn't take the hand. He stood with his shoulders relaxed, his black suit absorbing the light of the chandeliers, looking down at Victor with a cold, detached curiosity, as if he were observing a particularly persistent insect. Victor's smile faltered, his hand hovering in the air for a second too long before he awkwardly tucked it into his pocket. He continued to speak, his gestures becoming more animated, more frantic, as he tried to bridge the chasm of T-Jin's silence. He had no idea that the shipping magnate he was trying to impress was currently memorizing the exact shade of Amara's emerald pendant. T-Jin's gaze finally drifted away from Victor, cutting through the crowd with surgical precision until it landed directly on table 12. For a heartbeat, the noise of the wedding, the jazz, the laughter, the clinking of forks fell away. Victor turned, following the direction of the powerful man's stare, his expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, panicked irritation. He saw his ex-wife, dignified and heartbroken in her dark green dress, and for the first time that day, the confidence in his red jacket seemed to bleed away. He didn't understand the connection, but he could feel the temperature of the room dropping. The predator had entered the room, and Victor was finally realizing he wasn't the one at the top of the food chain. The shift was not a roar, but a sudden, terrifying silence that rippled outward from the center of the ballroom. It began the moment T-Jin turned his back on Victor mid-sentence, descending the stairs with a slow, predatory grace that commanded every eye in the room. The jazz quartet faltered, the brassy notes thinning into a hesitant murmur. As the guests realized the man who moved with the weight of an empire was not heading toward the head table. He was moving toward the shadows. Amara sat frozen, her hands still clasped under her chin, her knuckles white against her deep brown skin. She felt the gaze of 500 people pivot toward her like a physical blow. Beside her, the empty chairs at table 12 seemed to vibrate with the heavy thud of his handmade Italian leather shoes against the polished floor. The distance between them closed, 30 feet, 20, 10, until the air around her grew dense with the scent of expensive tobacco and cold rain. When he reached her, the world outside their immediate radius seemed to shatter into jagged glass. T-Jin did not look at the floral arches or the shimmering centerpieces. He looked only at the woman in the dark green dress. He leaned forward, the movement fluid and authoritative, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. The heat of his palms seeped through the reflective silk, an anchor in the middle of her storm. His fair complexion and the sharp, slicked-back lines of his black hair stood in stark contrast to the colorful, chaotic wedding finery surrounding them. "You look as if you are holding the weight of the ceiling on your shoulders, Dr. Obi," he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that cut through the silence. It wasn't the voice of a guest. It was the voice of a man who owned the room and everyone in it. From the dance floor, Victor and Tracy stood like statues of salt. The groom's red jacket, once a symbol of his loud triumph, now looked garish and small. Tracy's veil fluttered in a stray draft, her joyful expression replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated bewilderment. They were the stars of the evening, the ones who had successfully orchestrated Amara's public humiliation, yet the most powerful man in the room was treating them like background noise. Tijin didn't wait for her to answer. He pulled out the chair beside her, the one where Victor should have sat if he hadn't been a coward, and took his place. He didn't offer a polite smile or a wedding greeting. Instead, he leaned closer, his intense gaze locked onto hers with a focus that didn't blink. "2 years ago, you told me I had a choice to live," he whispered. "Tonight, Amara, the choice is yours, but you will not make it from the back row." The heavy, protective weight of Tijin's presence at the table provided a temporary sanctuary, but as the reception shifted toward dinner, the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom drove Amara toward the sanctuary of the ladies' lounge. She needed a moment to breathe, to splash cold water on a face that had worn the mask of the strong one for far too many hours. But the silence of the marble-tiled restroom was short-lived. The door swung open with a sharp, aggressive click, and Tracy stepped in, her white silk train sweeping across the floor like a predator's tail. The joyful bride persona had vanished. In the harsh, vanity bulb light, Tracy's features were sharp and cold. She didn't come to offer an olive branch. She came to reclaim the spotlight. "Who is he, Amara?" Tracy demanded, her voice vibrating with a frantic, jealous energy. She paced the small space, the lace of her gown rustling. "You were supposed to sit there and watch. You were supposed to feel what it's like to be the one left behind. But then that man walks in, that man who looks at Victor like he's nothing, and he sits with you." Amara turned from the mirror, her hands still damp, her emerald pendant catching the light. "I didn't ask him to be here, Tracy, and I certainly didn't ask Victor to betray me. You chose this." Tracy let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "You think this was just about Victor? You think I actually wanted to hear him drone on about logistics and supply chains every night?" She stepped closer, her medium brown skin flushed. "I wanted your life, Amara. I wanted the way people look at you. I spent 3 years in your guest room watching you walk through the door after a 20-hour shift, looking like a saint, and I hated you for it. I hated your grace. I hated that everyone, even Victor, thought you were the prize." The mask had finally cracked, revealing the hollow core of a woman who had spent years feeding on Amara's light. "You were so busy being the strong one, so busy saving the world, that you didn't even notice me taking him," Tracy hissed, her eyes narrowing. "It wasn't enough to have a business. I wanted the man you built. I wanted the respect you earned. But even today, on my wedding day, you find a way to make yourself the center. You find a man who makes Victor look like a child." Amara looked at the woman she had once called her sister and felt a strange, cooling sensation. The pain was still there, but the confusion was gone. Tracy hadn't stolen Victor out of love. She had stolen him as a trophy in a one-sided war Amara hadn't even known they were fighting. "You didn't take my grace, Tracy," Amara said softly, her voice steady as she reached for a paper towel. "You just took the man who didn't deserve it. You're wearing the white dress, but you're the one who looks small." Tracy's hand flew up as if to strike, but she froze, her gaze darting to the door. The power shift outside had followed them in. Amara didn't need to look back to know that the world Tracy had tried so hard to steal was already beginning to crumble. The door to the lounge didn't just open. It yielded to a force that brooked no resistance. Tijin stood in the threshold, his black suit a stark, dark silhouette against the ivory marble. He didn't look at Tracy, whose hand remained suspended in the air, trembling with a sudden, icy realization. His focus remained anchored on Amara, his expression as calm as the eye of a hurricane. "Your guests are beginning to wonder where the star of the show has gone," Tijin said, his voice dropping into the quiet room like a heavy stone. He finally turned his gaze toward Tracy. It wasn't a look of anger, it was a look of profound, chilling indifference. "But I suspect the bride is confused about which role she is playing tonight." Tracy pulled her hand back, clutching her white silk skirts. "This is a private conversation," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "You have no right." "I have every right to protect my investments," Tijin interrupted, stepping into the room. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace that made the small space feel claustrophobic. He came to a stop beside Amara, his presence dwarfing Tracy's frantic energy. "You talk about stealing a life, a man, a legacy. You speak as if you've conquered a kingdom, but you've only crawled into a hollow shell." He turned back to Amara, his intense gaze softening just enough for her to see the memory of that rain-slicked alleyway. "She calls you a saint to mock you," he said, loud enough for Tracy to hear every syllable. "She sees a nurse who smells of hospitals. She sees a woman who was useful enough to be discarded. But I see the woman who kept my heart beating when it wanted to stop. I see a woman who performed surgery in the back of a moving vehicle while men with rifles were closing in." Tracy's face went pale, the bravado of her earlier outburst curdling into fear. She looked from Tijin to Amara, the realization of the business Amara had actually been involved in finally dawning on her. "Amara Obi does not just provide comfort," Tijin continued, his voice hardening. "She holds the power of life and death in these hands. She saved a man the world is afraid of, not because she was told to, but because she is a sovereign force of her own." He looked Tracy up and down, his lip curling in a faint, devastating sneer. "You didn't take her life, little girl. You just took her trash. And now, you are going to walk back into that ballroom and realize that, while you were busy trying to be her, she was becoming someone you will never even be allowed to look at." He offered his arm to Amara. The heat of the room seemed to shift, the power dynamic snapping into its final, permanent alignment. Amara reached out, her fingers steady as they brushed the black wool of his sleeve. She didn't look at Tracy again. She didn't need to. The mask was gone, and for the first time in 7 years, Amara wasn't the one holding it up. The hallway outside the lounge was a long, silent gallery of gold-framed mirrors, reflecting a version of Amara she barely recognized. As they walked, the distant thumping of the wedding DJ felt like a pulse from a dying world. Tijin didn't lead her back to the noise. Instead, he steered her toward a secluded terrace where the night air of Lagos smelled of salt and impending rain. He stopped by the stone balustrade and turned to her, the moonlight catching the sharp lines of his profile. "The man back there, Victor," Tijin began, the name sounding like a curse in his mouth. "He thinks he has built a kingdom. He thinks his trucks and his warehouses make him a giant. He is a child playing with blocks." Amara gripped the railing, the emerald on her neck feeling heavier than before. "He took everything I had to give, Tijin. He took the years I can't get back." "Then let us take the future he thinks he's earned," Tijin said. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a slim, black leather folder. "I did not come here tonight just to witness a tragedy. I came to propose a merger." He opened the folder to reveal a document embossed with a seal Amara recognized from global financial news, the mark of the Kang Syndicate's philanthropic arm. "I am establishing a Pan-African medical foundation, research centers, trauma units, and mobile clinics that will reach the corners of the continent where the light doesn't touch. I want a chief executive who knows the value of a life because she has fought for one in the dark." Amara looked at the figures on the page, funding that rendered Victor's entire logistics empire a mere rounding error. It was more than wealth. It was leverage. It was the power to build something that would make Victor, success, look like a footnote in history. "By the time this foundation is operational," Tijin continued, his voice low and dangerous, "every port, every road, and every warehouse Victor needs for his business will belong to a network that reports to you. You won't just be a doctor, Amara. You will be the son he has to ask permission from just to rise." Amara looked at the document, then back at the man who stood before her. This wasn't a gift, it was a weapon. It was a contract that recognized the surgeon, the strategist, and the survivor within her. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because the world only sees what people can take from you," Tijin said, stepping closer until the scent of his cologne drowned out the fatting lilies of the wedding. "I am the only one who sees what you are capable of giving. This isn't pity, Amara. This is a transaction. You gave me a second chance. Now give yourself one." Amara reached out, her fingers grazing the edge of the paper. The strong one wasn't tired anymore. She was hungry. For the first time, she wasn't signing a loan for someone else's dream. She was claiming her own. The ballroom doors swung open, but this time Amara wasn't slipping through them like a shadow. She walked at the center of the frame, her hand resting firmly on Tijin's arm. The fabric of his suit felt like armor beneath her fingertips. As they re-entered the reception, the music didn't just falter, it died. The jazz quartet lowered their instruments, and the sea of guests parted with a rhythmic, sweeping silence that felt more respectful than any applause she had heard that day. At the head table, Victor stood paralyzed. His red jacket was wrinkled now, his face a mask of sweating, desperate confusion. Beside him, Tracy looked like a ghost draped in expensive lace, her eyes wide as she watched the woman she tried to bury walk past her with the most powerful man in the room. Amara felt their stares, Victor's panicked realization that he had discarded a diamond for a pebble, and Tracy's stinging knowledge that the spotlight had moved on. For 7 years, Amara's world had revolved around the man in the red suit. She had been his shadow, his silence, and his foundation. But as she crossed the polished floor, she realized she didn't even feel anger toward him anymore. Anger required an investment, and her accounts with Victor Akoy were officially closed. He was no longer a husband or a heartbreak. He was simply a stranger standing in a room she was finished with. Tijin didn't slow his pace. He didn't give the onlookers the satisfaction of a dramatic pause or a parting shot. His presence was the statement. As they reached the grand mahogany doors of the exit, the valet stood ready, the cool night air of Lagos rushing in to replace the stifling scent of lilies and betrayal. Amara felt the weight of the emerald pendant against her skin, no longer a symbol of irony, but a badge of survival. She didn't look back at the altar where her life had supposedly ended. She didn't look at the family that had demanded she perform grace while being gutted. She looked straight ahead at the line of black SUVs waiting under the portico, their engines humming like a promise. "Are you ready?" Tijin asked, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. "I've been ready for a long time," Amara replied. She stepped out into the night, the rain finally beginning to fall in fat, cleansing drops. The strong one was gone, replaced by a woman who finally understood that her strength wasn't a resource for others to harvest. It was a kingdom for her to rule. As the car door closed, muffling the distant sounds of a wedding that no longer mattered, Amara Obi finally turned her face toward the dark, beautiful horizon of her own life.